And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're receiving this information. My name is Rafael Vasquez Guzman, and this is Chisme is Life. Our new podcast continues to expand into multiple subjects that matter to the Latina, Latinx community. And at some point, we will touch on another topic, which is, am I Latino? Am I Latina? Am I Latinx? Am I Hispanic? Am I Chicanx? Where do I fit? But for today's purposes, we are privileged to have Adrian Avalos, who is someone who's familiar with the work that we have been doing for a while. And so, Adrian, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking the time from your master's program to be here and chit chat with us for a little bit.
Thanks for having me.
Definitely. So let's start with something basic, like what is it that you're doing? And the topic of today is the No-Sabo kids, right? There is a whole lot of games that you can purchase online. There is the Yo-Sabo, there is the No-Sabo. Um, but it's important to analyze it from the point of view of what makes somebody a no-sabo kid, right? What is your definition of it?
Well, for me, the way I see it is kind of like more of a cultural phenomenon of like with a lot of, Latina slash Hispanic, families moving into North America or they're already in North America, or they might be coming from South America upwards and heading into the United States. A lot of them, it has like that culture, that need to fit in, right? There's a lot of cultural assimilation where they feel like they need to, do the more standard white ways of like speaking in order to not face like criticism or be bullied or harassed at schools or like work environments. So oftentimes parents or children themselves feel like they can't speak Spanish or they can only speak Spanish at home or like very limited amounts of Spanish speaking is going on. So I kind of see it as a no-sabo generation of like after each generation where it's being exposed to do different cultures that clash against each other, that it turns into, people who are like, their Spanish is like, oh, it's más o menos, it's all right, it's more or less like, and that's kind of the position I find myself in now currently, but due to my not wanting to speak Spanish with growing up.
Yeah, and so it's important for us to clarify that this is not unique to the Latinx community. I will personally continue to use the word Latinx, and I respect that other people self-identify. Um, but this happened with the Irish when they came to the US, right? They were forced to forget their language, their cultural values, beliefs, norms. It happened to the French, it happened to the Italians, it happened to everybody, right? And so, as you clearly said, when people migrate from Latin America to the US, and first generation or parents, for example, my situation myself, we were treated differently, discriminated, yelled at, or just told we would never succeed because we spoke limited English, or we speak to this day English with an accent. And so we didn't want our children to suffer. And as a result of that, at home, a lot of the parents tolerate that their kids speak English only. And so it's kind of interesting to see that parents will say, saca la basura, right? And instead of saying, ya voy, kids will say, okay, I'll do it in a minute, right? Or whatever the situation, or in a bit, or when I'm done with this commercial, or whatever the situation may be.
Mhm.
But parents tolerate that because parents have experienced so much neglect, abuse, and bullying at work that they don't want that for their children. But there are consequences to that, right? So, talk to us about, again, your experience growing up as somebody who either didn't have to speak Spanish because maybe your parents could speak English, or again, maybe you experienced some of that bullying yourself.
So for me personally, I felt like growing up, my parents really tried like having Spanish be spoken around me. My babysitter only spoke to me in Spanish, and for some reason it just didn't stick. And I don't remember this personally, but my mom would tell me that I would say that, oh, we live in the United States, we speak English here. And now hearing that I said that, I'm like, to me that's crazy because that's not how it should be. So I'm not sure where I got that idea from. I don't know if I heard it at school or I don't know if I just see it from like watching TV shows only in English or stuff like that. So it just was stuff that didn't stick to me. And then as well as that, growing up, I had like a speech impediment where I couldn't pronounce my R's. And R in Espanol it's super, I feel like super important in a lot of like the things that you say. So then when I would try to speak Spanish, oftentimes I would get like corrected or like made fun of for speaking Spanish. So it's kind of like I defaulted to just working on my English. And I think that also contributed to like my lack of speaking Spanish. Because growing up, like I was like even like soccer teams, I was with a lot of Hispanic teammates who would also speak a lot of Spanish, but oftentimes it would just like I was a little more shy, so I wouldn't interact with them as much. So I think I just didn't get that much practice or experience in of like having that humility growing up of like trying to speak Spanish. And then so it also affected like my relationships like with my grandparents, who I'm thankful to have. All my parents are currently alive, and my connection with them was non-existent growing up because my limited ability to speak Spanish. And so it would be a lot of like, uh-huh, yeah, see, and then just like very limited interactions with them. So I think there was more of like an internalized pushback against speaking Spanish based on like just the combinations of experiences.
Yeah, so that's what we call internalized oppression or internalized racism. Again, at what point and how did you absorb that? We don't necessarily know, but I've seen it multiple times from multiple people, either in the classroom as a professor or when I visited high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools with Latinx kids who, again, don't speak a single word of Spanish. And sometimes the challenge for our ancestral ways of learning of grandma and grandpa teaching us about our ancestry or people or cultural values, beliefs, and norms in Spanish, right? Because
Hmm.
many of us no longer speak our indigenous ancestral languages, but el abuelo or la abuela would say, let me tell you about my childhood. And if you don't communicate, eventually it creates this Grand Canyon between you and your grandpa and your grandma who will love you to death, but they don't feel that connection because they cannot speak your language and you're not speaking their language. And as a result of that, there's that separation. And I think that a lot of students, and again, in my many years of doing this work, a lot of students later in life, in their 20s and 30s, sometimes they come back and they are like, oh, I wish I could still talk to my grandparents. I wish I could speak with this person or that other person, but I never learned the language. And so I even remember back many, many decades ago when I was a high school student, I was put in a Spanish for Spanish speakers only class just to pass the time because it was a requirement for high school graduation. And there were a couple of Chicanos who, again, this is like third, fourth generation US born kids from ancestral parents from Mexico, and they were angry taking Spanish 1, like basic introduction, and they were angry at their parents because their parents never taught them Spanish. And now they were having to dedicate a whole year to take this class because, again, they needed it for graduation. So instead of just getting a check off um, in their transcript, they needed to learn for something that they could have learned for free in their own home. And so there was certain level of anger from those individuals. But again, now that you are working on your master's program to become a bilingual therapist, I would say, how has this affected you, or how does this increase your want and need to learn Spanish properly?
So I think that started. It's interesting you bring up the high school thing because that's kind of what happened to me. There was a Spanish for Spanish speakers, but there's also just normal Spanish classes. And originally, that's what I signed up for was the normal Spanish. And then they're like, "Oh, there's an option to test out of this if you want." So then I'm like, "Oh yeah, like I know Spanish." So I took the test, and my teacher didn't say anything. He was just like, "Oh, I think you can like stay in this class because of, like maybe some, maybe you learned how to speak Spanish or like some ways to speaking Spanish, but your reading and writing is just, not there." So I'm like, "Okay." I was kind of embarrassed, but I was really fortunate and thankful that I did start at the beginning because I was able to start building my foundation there rather than like having that anger. It was like kind of a thankfulness. I like, okay, now I'm kind of learning the very basics to then be able to start like at home because sometimes there's also a lot of Spanish speakers who only speak Spanish. They can't read or write it as well because of their only interactions is through the home. And so learning how to read and write also helps start building that level of understanding of like, oh man, my level is not at all where I thought it was.
Mhm.
And it kind of like humbled me a bit. And so throughout all my years of high school, I stayed doing Spanish until I did the AP Spanish exam class or whatever. And did go well in that and was able to, use that for credit for college. And then it was like, okay, well, I did Spanish. I did the college level Spanish. In my undergrad, I didn't really pursue any more Spanish after that. I'm like, okay, well, I did in high school. Like I can speak a bit better now, but I didn't see the need to do it because I'm like, oh, I'm just going to become a therapist. The idea of doing therapist in English and Spanish hadn't come to me yet. It was just like, okay, this is the tunnel vision that I'm going on. This is the path I'm taking. I didn't see that there was other options yet. And so it wasn't really until that I would say kind of through COVID time with all the isolation, it kind of made me realize like, oh man, like, how important connection was to me and just having a disconnect from family and friends and especially my grandparents and like more of my my Mexican family. It kind of made me realize like how the language connected me with that and not having a time of like not really speaking, even though you could still over the phone and stuff like that. It was just more of the time I would speak to my family would be like in like the fiestas or the parties and when we do carne asada. So just not having that kind of also put things into perspective of like, oh wow, like mental health and the the Latina community is just, it's not something as much talked about.
Mhm.
And as a Mexican male, I was kind of seeing the patterns of like with mental health, it's like, oh, just get over it, like it's just a phase, you'll be fine. There's a lot of like words and technical terms that are not understood that have a name in English but not in Spanish, and it's not commonly as known. So that's when I kind of understood like, okay, there is a need for this, like especially in my community.
Mhm.
And so I was able to reach out, eventually to you and do some work for Líderes del Futuro. And through that, I was able to better connect with, DACA and undocumented recipients and individuals. So through that experience, I was also be able to broaden my horizons even more. And then at the same time, I also started doing research for Sonoma State University as a research assistant, studying Latina slash Hispanic married couples in the Northern Bay Area. And that was also like, you know, it was scary at first because it was, at first I started doing the interviews in English, and because there was such a need for Spanish speakers in my research lab, they're like, "Well, Adrian, do you want to try?" And I was really nervous because I'm like, "Well, Spanish is like, it's all right," but eventually I'm like, you know what? Yeah, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna try it, and it was kind of like messy at first, but just being able to speak to my community, they were really appreciative, and they just thanked me like, "Thank you for even." Trying to speak to me in Spanish. Like they were really appreciative of it, that I was even just making that effort. And so that kind of like pushed me even more of like, okay, I want to connect with my community better. I want to better talk and, Spanish was a way to do that. Spanish was a way to have that build that connection with them. And so that pushed me even more to like when I finished my bachelor's degree, my undergrad, I'm like, okay, if I want to become a therapist and be able to help out my, Hispanic community, I'm going to need to like, work on my Spanish. And so when I was looking at master's programs, there was one that stood out to me of San Diego State University, where seemed like they had a really huge emphasis on culture. And what really lured me to that was that after it was like a general basic overview of the program, but they're on the side, they're like, oh, if you want to stay longer, there is a Spanish decolonial learning program opportunity if you do get accepted into the program. So I stayed and kind of blew my mind of like, they talked about discussing a lot of like how learning can be different from the United States way, the American way, and how there's so many different ways of learning with, your language integrated into that. And kind of the idea of decolonial learning is like a lot of the ideas we learn is from, European, Western, democratic ideas. And typically Hispanic values are not really considered often. So I decided to, go through with that program. I got accepted, and it was a great opportunity for me. I'm currently still in it, and just, some of my classes are like they only speak Spanish or like a mix in both. It's kind of Spanglish. It's accepting the borderlands between both English and Spanish. And I think that's where I find like I have a place there, and kind of I feel like my identity, continuously forming through that.
And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, which was important, is your name, right? Like Adrian. And one of the things that also, when we talk about this No-Sabo kid situation, just this week in my classes, we take roll, of course,
Hmm.
and I have probably 50% Latino, Latina, Latinx students in my classes, and I'm calling out the names, and I always ask, is it, for example, is it Adrian or is it Adrian? And there's always one that will say, it doesn't matter, or either way. And it's like, no, what was the intention of your parents when they gave you the name? And for many of these individuals, this is the first time that somebody put them in that situation, because it happened with me when I migrated to this country as a refugee many decades ago, where my name went from Rafael to Rafael within half hour of registering at my high school, right? And the spelling of my name changed from Rafael to
Mm.
Raphael. And then my last name was screwed up. The first part of my last name, Vasquez, because they put Vasquez. And then the second last name, Guzman, completely disappeared from any of my records. And that followed me in high school, college, and I think we didn't fix it until I was getting my master's. And so, again, this idea that we want to fit in and being pushed to fit in, where you stop questioning things like, do we pronounce your name as Adrian or Adrian? And that's just the beginning of kind of erasing a lot of pieces about your identity as an individual. And so I'm glad that you are dedicating the energy, I would say, to this program, your master's program, so that you can continue to, again, learn in order to provide the right type of therapeutic services to those individuals who choose to receive services in Spanish. Because that's the other reality, right? There are people who are completely bilingual, but for therapeutic services, they may choose to do therapy in Spanish because there are certain emotions that are expressed completely different in Spanish than they are in English. And so I'm glad that you're doing that. And again, the work that you did with the DACA recipients, and then when we went to Mexico in March of 2025, and again, you seem to be so comfortable working with this undocu students who went to this educational program, and the emotions that came up, right? It was funny because they all kept referring to you as their group therapist, because you were so accessible. But again, it's that bilingualism, because sometimes they wanted to express certain emotions in English and sometimes in Spanish, and you were just so accessible. And I think that's the type of therapist that is needed in our communities, in our immigrant refugee communities nowadays. And again, the fact that a lot of individuals go through their lives with regret at not knowing, but because of the many pressures from this country at forget your original culture, forget the language, forget, right? And going back to my original point of the Irish and Italians and everybody else, I inquire in my classes this week and I said, how many of you are Irish? And in one class, I think it was one. The other classes, maybe three or four. And then a lot of them, they have no idea because in order to be accepted as white, as in quotes, Americans, they had to give up their history and everything else. And one of the things that I explained to them, which becomes a reality for a lot of the No-Sabo kids, is that it doesn't matter if you speak English perfectly, if you have mastered the cultural values and everything else about this country, as long as you have brown skin, you will never be accepted as an equal.
Hmm.
And so eventually, in some environments, you will be expected to be the expert on the Latinx community, and yet you don't speak the language and you have distanced yourself so far away from your culture that sometimes that's where that anger comes in. And it may be in your 20s, your 30s, or your 40s sometimes. So I'm glad that you kind of have embraced wanting to learn not just the language, but the culture that comes with it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of things came up in my head when you mentioned that. I guess the first thing that came to my mind was even just representing yourself of like I have a lot of I like soccer, I like football. So I have a lot of like soccer t-shirts and nowadays when before I usually put them on when I go out and I want to be, just with like shorts or stuff like that, more casual. I had to think like if I put this on, will I be, you know, um, racially profiled, right? Will I be like targeted as a Mexican, currently, especially in these times? And the other day, I still put it on. I went on a walk to my post office, and the older lady came up to me and started speaking Spanish. And, we were just chatting, and she was heading to the trolley. And she was like telling me about like the passing of her husband and, how she got a new phone. And just like, it was a really nice chat. It was the highlight of my day. And, I was really glad that she came up and talked to me because it just felt nice having that connection. And, the way I presented myself, I guess allowed someone to like, be able to connect with me and not trying to hide, my Mexican values or my Mexican culture kind of allowed for that connection to occur in that moment. And I think that was really like something special to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it's about accessibility, right? Like it's the equivalent of saying, "I'm here and I'm approachable. Come and talk to me," type of thing. And so here at the college where I typically work, we have the opportunity. Last year we had the opportunity, and one of the worker unions, I believe, provided this name tags. And so it has my name, and at the bottom it says Hablo Español.
Mm,
And then I got the new one, but then I went back and it's like, oh, I've always used to have one of those. And it just makes you more approachable, right? They don't even have to ask, oh, do you speak Spanish? It's like, oh, it's in my name, right? It's in my name tag. Because then we also have that angry person that says, and insults kids when they don't speak Spanish. How can you be Mexican if you don't speak Spanish? Well, what are the many factors that come into it? And we've covered it to a certain degree, right? The bullying, the family acceptance that this is better than to be made fun of and everything else. But as a no-sabo kid, you get it from both sides, right?
mhm.
If you speak Spanish, sometimes somebody will approach you, especially if you're young, and will tell you, speak English, right, in the class or in the community. But if you don't speak the language and you are in the Latinx community, you may be insulted, you may be called out for not speaking the language. And so it's a lose-lose situation sometimes with this type of no-sabo kid because it may not have been their choice to not learn the language.
That reminds me too of like ESL learning and, from elementary to high school. I remember seeing a lot of classmates go to ESL and I was wondering like, why am I not in that program? Why didn't they put me there? I kind of thought that's where I had to go just because as a kid, my understanding wasn't like, oh, you're speaking Spanish, so they're gonna help you with, these English classes. It was kind of like, oh, I kind of look like them, shouldn't I be with them? So I think even as an early age, that's how I kind of identified the world of like, well, shouldn't I be like them? Like, and then yeah, just growing up, it was, oh, you speak English very well or stuff like that. And it's like, well, no shit, I live here. Sorry for cussing. I don't know. I've lived here my whole life, and it makes sense I can speak English, but then I kind of think about Spanish. I'm like, well, I've also been raised Mexican my whole life, and my Spanish is more intermediate. So it is nice kind of thinking back of like, why is it that way? Why did I learn what I learned? And while I might not know it all, but just having some pieces, I think helps build more understanding and confidence of to allow that healing.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, that internalized oppression that many individuals go through, there is this piece, it's a short reading that is called The Hatred Within. And how many of those No-Sabo kids, again, and that's what it's all about, right? Like this young man that grows up in this, for the most part, white-only environment, and the kids call him racist names, and to a certain degree he learns to accept that because subconsciously for him it's part of living in that community, attending those schools, so on and so forth. And it's not until he goes to college that he has this internalized hatred, internalized racism, and he sees a flyer about MECHA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicanista de Aztlán, um, and at the university. And so it says the first meeting of the semester or the year is happening, right? So in his mind, he's like, well, if I got accepted to this university because of my last name, that's his understanding of it. I at least owe it to go to one of these goofy meetings. And so he shows up and they all sit in a circle. And the first thing that they do is they do brief introductions, right? In the college where I am for the last 21 years, I have been the advisor for that organization. And the first thing we do is exactly the same thing. What is your name? What is your major? And we have what we call question of the day. And so in this situation, he says that when he sees people are answering, some people say their names in Spanish, some say their name in English, and that's the first question. Well, how do I say my name? Do I say it in English? Do I say it in Spanish? Right? And once they get to him, is the beginning of undoing that self-hatred, that internalized oppression. And so by the time he goes back, I think it was for Thanksgiving, from college to his community, he runs into the same kids that used to be racist, and he basically accepted it. And one of them called him a racist name. And that's when, for the first time, he valued his identity and he says, don't do that anymore. And the other kid, the white kid, continues to kind of say something and justifies it. And he's like, that's not who I am. That's never who I have been. Obviously, I was ignorant and I suffer from this internalized hatred, but that's not who I am anymore. And if you're going to continue with that, we can no longer associate, right? And college was the beginning, and in that situation, Mecha was the beginning of his liberation from his perception of what his identity was to who he really was. And so, again, no-Sabo kids feel sometimes that in order to be fully accepted in this community, they have to speak only English, have to behave in a certain way, have to dress in a certain way, have to speak a certain way, not just English, but in a certain manner. And when they don't, right, they feel this rejection. Now, as somebody who's studying psychology, you fully understand that as a teenager, you are always looking for where do I fit in? And if in your community, behaving like a white European person is the way to go, because that's the only way that you're going to be accepted, then many of these kids also will refuse to speak Spanish anymore, even if they did before, with hopes to be fully accepted, only to, again, because of police brutality, or again, whatever the situation may be,
Hmm.
you end up in a situation where you recognize that you will never be fully accepted, right? And so that is a shock that can lead to depression and anxiety and all these other emotions, but self-hatred being one of them.
100%.
So, how has it been for you in this master's program? Because again, you just started about a semester ago.
Hmm.
But how has it been to be in a program that appears to be very diverse, not just, again, whites and Mexicans or Chicanos or Latinos, but it sounds like you have much more diversity, to the point that you're just not learning how to provide therapeutic services to white Anglo individuals and Latino, Chicanos, Latinx, but people from other ethnicities. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, of course. So my program's really interesting because I would say there's no one like traditionally white, where it's like every single person there is a person of, of color or of a different background. And there's, stuff from like a lot of like Silk Road cultures, such as, it's like there's Palestinians, there's people from Jordan, people from Saudi Arabia, there's people from China, there's also people from Korea, there's people who are black, there's a lot of, Hispanic people, some people like, from different places like Colombia as well. So it's a huge, huge like melting pot of different identities and cultures. So it's kind of like being also at the same time as I'm being more exposed to my own culture and like hearing different stories of, of classmates who've had their own experiences. I'm also hearing about people from other cultures different from mine that I've never interacted with before in my whole entire life. And so that even has just been broadening my view even more past what I even know about, like, because I feel like a huge thing is the area that you're in, right? The schools you go to, the parents that you have, how much you interact with them, the people in your life. I feel like that really shapes your understanding and learning of the language. Because if you go to a more, traditionally white school with, less Hispanics, then you're most likely going to be less exposed to speaking Spanish and stuff like that. Versus if you go to a more, Hispanic dominated school or environment or community, then that's what you're going to be growing up knowing and learning. So, and sometimes you don't have a choice with growing up. Sometimes your parents make the decision. Maybe it might be based on financials. There is a lot of things that go into, where you are and where you live and, what you can afford. That's a whole other topic, but I feel like
Mhm.
that is a huge impact on how you're learning. Because let's say you go to a more traditional white school and you try speaking Spanish, a teacher may feel that you're talking trash about them or that you're saying things behind their back that they don't understand. So they might shut that down immediately. Versus if you have a Spanish speaking teacher who, understands, what's going on, the jokes, they'll continue to let that education flourish and happen. And that's kind of what I'm seeing here in my current school of because they're so familiar with culture, because they're so they're comfortable with, that difference, it allows everyone to learn from each other. And that's kind of a model that they take of, you know, rather than the teacher being a teacher or someone higher above us, we're equal with them. We're colleagues. I'm not just a student. I'm currently a marriage and family therapist trainee.
Mhm.
So I'm now past the student now, where it's like we learn from each other and we also teach each other. And that experience, I think, is what has made me even more comfortable in my identity because I see other individuals who are also kind of no-sabo like me, who were at first scared to kind of speak Spanish, but seeing them just, try it anyways, and everyone having that, like warmth and compassion of like, yeah, like we'll help you out when you need help. That's what like building that kind of environment and community, I think, is what allows me personally to be able to feel comfortable, like even more comfortable speaking Spanish and learning the importance of it for others. Because there's other people who were born in Mexico in my program who are here under DACA. And they speak Spanish fluently, and for them sometimes it's English is the thing that they struggle a bit in. And so also having that comfortability of like, oh, if you need help in English too, like, we'll be here to support you. So it's kind of the idea of like of joining hands at the borderlands
Yeah.
and seeing that as well as other people coming from different countries too, just to, learn together about, you know, how different therapy can be. Because I think a huge thing too is the idea of family. And oftentimes there's very Eurocentric views that therapy is an individual thing only, that you only focus on one person, and that, as a result, there's a hope that people around them, will get help as well, get fixed as well, quotation marks. But I really think because of, my culture, I see how important family is and how interconnected it is. And even being disconnected from family, that's still an interaction between family that I think impacts someone. So just being able to think about, the language of Spanish as well as the idea of therapy in the lens of, a family unit, a family dynamic, a community dynamic, if anything, actually. I think that's what gives so much power to the idea of speaking Spanish and as well to the idea of therapy, because we are connected in the end of the day, whether or not, you walk by people, you drive by people, you look at people, like there's always going to be people around. And that's like part of being the human experience. So I think Spanish is like a tiny, tiny component of that, right? Because there's so many different languages and there's so many different cultures, even within the idea of Spanish, right? That's a whole other thing of like in high school, I learned a certain kind of Spanish, right? Whereas like Spaniard Spanish mixed into it. Whereas like even in Mexico, there's so many different ways because like you were saying, like we no longer speak our, a lot of people no longer speak our original language. It's now been replaced by Spanish, but that Spanish is so, so, so different. So
Mhm.
even like my professor, she's from Colombia, and the way she speaks Spanish is different than the way I speak Spanish, which is different than the way my classmates speak Spanish. But still, through that Spanish, we're able to connect to each other and like explain, oh, what does that word mean for you? Like, oh, this word means this for me. So I'm like, oh, what does that mean? So learning that too is also allowing to us to build those connections together.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because, as you clearly stated, there are different versions of Spanish, right? And so there's going to be things that, to a certain degree, kind of separate us if we speak Spanish. But at the same time, and again, as you said, there's so many pieces that we can cover, and we have already 40 topics that this podcast is already planning. Um, but one of them is obviously about the cultural things that bring us together. And this is just going to be a quick introduction, and that is something like Dia de los Muertos.
Hmm.
Regardless of what culture in Latin America you come from, what indigenous group, or there is Dia de los Muertos, right? And so for the No-Sabo kid, you might not know how to speak Spanish properly, whatever that means as well, because language is something that is evolving all the time,
Hmm.
but you can still celebrate holidays that bring you together with abuelos and abuelas and everybody else, which includes again Dia de los Muertos, maybe La Posada, maybe other holidays that create that cultural experience for people. And so, for those individuals who may be listening to this podcast and say, "Well, I am a no-sabo kid, is it too late for me to learn Spanish?" The answer is absolutely not. The answer is, as long as you connect with the people in your cultures, right? You can pick up different words and slowly maybe choose to go to your community college and take a class. Um, Spend more time in the community, at the market, at the
Hmm.
park, at other spaces. And again, learn. So it's never too late. It's just like for people who came here as immigrants, and some of us learn English at 15, but there's people who are in their 40s and 50s and they're like, oh, estoy muy vieja para aprender inglés. It's like, no, you're not too old to learn the language. If you choose to do so, you can do so. And so at least that's my invitation, and then I'll invite you to give us your opinion on it. But my invitation is you're never too old to learn Spanish. You're never too old to learn about your culture, your ancestral culture, and you're never too old to connect with people from your culture. And so I know that when you went with us to Mexico in March, you got to see again Las Abuelas from Cuernavaca. You got to go to the museum and other spaces. These are people and places that hold ancestral knowledge. So for those no-sabo kids, again, there's a lot of knowledge out there. You just have to choose to learn from it.
Yeah, I feel like at times too, it can kind of feel like, you know, the term like gatekeeping.
Mhm.
So like, there's a lot of like gatekeeping around kind of Spanish ideas and like, oh, you're not, you know, you're not Mexican, so you can't do this, or like, kind of the idea of, I feel like, I don't know, it depends on each person, right? But I want to share my culture, you know, I want to tell others about it. I want to express, you know, the values that we have, or even like the holidays we have, and share that with others, because I think there is something really like, you know, beautiful in it. It's important to me, so I want to share that with others. And like you said, there is a lot of different ways, you know, to learn this, you know, your culture and your ideas, because you know, with the, you know, online internet, there's so many different ways of learning too, and so many like resources that you can access. And it's kind of sad too, like um on my, you know, my social media pages, you know, which I shouldn't be going on too much, but um for a while my videos were only in English. And then whenever a Spanish video popped up, I tried interacting with it more, so that way the algorithm could pick up like, oh, I want to listen to more
Mhm.
videos in Spanish, you know, so I can try to pick up on those small things. And that was kind of one way of learning. But then with AI, sometimes those videos would be automatically translated into
Yes.
English. And I was really confused when that first happened. I'm like, are these like AI generated videos, or like what's going on? Like, and then I realized without even like asking me, these videos were automatically turning into English videos.
Mhm.
And I'm like, oh, I need to turn that off. Like, I don't like how that sounds. It felt weird. And I figured out how to turn it back into Spanish, but that's like another way of like, I feel like you can connect with the culture and kind of, there's also a lot of like, in English, there's a lot of like, you know, meme culture, like joke culture.
Mhm.
Whereas like in Spanish, that's something that can be hard to connect with if you're not interacting with that space as well online, and like kind of like what's the new terms, because I know nowadays these kids these kids that have so many different like jokes
Yeah.
and, you know, kind of their own language almost, that if you're not interacting with kids, or if you're not interacting online, you're not going to, you know, learn that language and be able to connect. But I'm assuming it's the same in Spanish, right? Where they have their own jokes and their own
Mhm.
culture that, you know, if you don't interact with that, or if like the social media blocks you out from that, then you won't learn that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, you don't have to be Mexican to learn Spanish with sources from Mexico. Again, INA, the Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, so INAH. That MX. You can find it on Instagram. You can find it on their website, and they have lots of videos that will teach you about Latin America, that will teach you about Mexico, that will teach you about ancestral cultures. And again, practice, and you can turn on the captions, and that way you can see the words as you're listening to the words and capture a word here, capture a word there. But again, for those individuals who want to learn and maybe you're not able to afford going to college and learning this, there are apps like Duolingo, there's other sources, and of course, there's grandma maybe, or the neighbor, or whomever it is. If you really want to learn, then you can learn. But we invite you to, again, take this into consideration because, to a certain degree, language is so much part of our identity. And while I wish that I myself had learned Mixteco many, many years ago, I didn't. At this moment, I only manage Spanish and English. But again, it's so beautiful. Somebody who's privileged and can travel to Mexico, it's so beautiful when you land in Mexico and you understand everything they're saying and you can communicate with them and all of those pieces. But I do what you do, which is sometimes when I go to a restaurant locally, if I recognize that the waiter is bilingual, I will only communicate in Spanish with the waiter or the waitress, specifically because we create community that way. And so
Hmm.
for me, I know that some of the people at the tables next to me might not like it. But to me, it makes me much more connected to the community. And so, again, there are so many benefits of speaking Spanish. And never be ashamed if you are today a no-sabo kid, because likely it was beyond your control at the beginning, but as always, starting today, it's in your hands if you want to learn the language.
Hmm.
So we have a couple of minutes. Any recommendations as somebody who was at some point a no sabo kid and now you are mastering the Spanish language? Any recommendations, either tools or the benefits of it or anything else?
Yeah, I think, well, first the tip I have is just, kind of break down your walls, break down your barriers. If you mess up, you mess up. That's how you learn, right? Especially with the language. It's okay to have that, kind of humility and kind of, don't be embarrassed to speak Spanish because I feel like that was something that stopped me a lot of like, oh, people aren't going to understand me, they aren't going to correct me. And sometimes they won't. That's all right. You try to figure out different ways of saying it. Try to figure out what can you pull from your vocab, or sometimes you would just ask, what does that word mean? ¿Qué significa? What does that mean? How like try to build and have that understanding that, it's okay not to know everything. It's okay not to know every single word. It's okay to not be able to 100%, talk to someone in their language. But that's how you learn. And I think another tip I have is, try to, a big one is try thinking in Spanish. That's something that I think helps me a lot is because before I'd only kind of think in English, but then sometimes in my dreams, it would be communicating in Spanish. And so I find that sometimes when I think in Spanish and then translate that to English or back and forth, that also helps me get into the mindset of like, okay, this is what that means. And if I don't know what, like, how can I translate what I'm thinking in English into Spanish, looking it up, like as messy as it can be translating, whole entire phrases and sentences from English to Spanish, sometimes just single words, looking that up kind of builds that knowledge and builds that vocabulary for you. And so just doing that over and over again, I think kind of slowly you start building the pieces in order to better understand the language. And another tip that I've been told is that, you can watch a show, like shows that you've already watched in English and then in Spanish, and then also put the subtitles in Spanish. Because if you put it in English, you're only going to be paying attention to reading the words. You're not going to be paying attention to the way that the things are being said or how they sound. But if you actually hear the word and connect it to visually seeing the word as well, that helps also build that understanding as well. So it's like a lot of stuff that you can do in your daily life that, doesn't take, having to go to like classes or other schools to do that. It's, smaller things that you can do in your life to help start building it slowly. And that's okay. It might take time, especially as you're older. It is harder to learn a language.
One of the things that I found most interesting years and years ago is when the movie of Shrek came out, right? And you watch it in English and it's hilarious. But if you understand Spanish and understand the jokes, which is something that you mentioned earlier, and you watch it in Spanish, it's a whole different experience, right?
Mhm.
And so those people who have that understanding and they're listening to this thing, you know what I'm talking about, where in English, you laugh at the jokes, and yes, but in Spanish, it's like a whole experience altogether. It's a whole level. And then if you're sitting next to somebody who also understands the jokes and the comments and all of the stuff, it just the room gets so loud because you're just laughing together, and that becomes a community experience, right? So that's another benefit as to why you should consider learning Spanish, better in your Spanish, and from understanding it from that cultural perspective, because again, you will have a whole different experience. And so While I don't like to promote the specific things, and we don't benefit from it, obviously, but Shrek in English and then compare it in Spanish, or ask somebody who speaks Spanish and understands it, and ask them to compare it for you, whomever you're listening, and you will understand one of the greatest benefits is understanding in their own language, the jokes and everything else. It's just a lot of fun. And so Adrian, it's fun checking in with you
Mm.
here on the show. Chisme is life. I think that you have a lot to contribute. Again, our collaboration with Líderes del Futuro Avanzando this last year was essential, and we're grateful. But we're glad that you're now doing your master's program, that you're getting a lot of training from diverse cultural perspectives. And so I look forward to our next conversation. I'm sure we'll be able to engage into positive dialogue and chisme. Um, and again, I want to thank you for taking the time and being here with us at Chisme is Live. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me. Same for you, and I love talking.
Thank you.